Hello and welcome. Today is, as of this recording, is May 1st, 2024. And it is the first day of the month, which is Mental Health Awareness Month in the United States. And so all of my content is being geared towards promoting mental health awareness. And to do that, I have invited a very special person to help us understand what we need to know and learn and give us some resources about mental health. And that happens to be my daughter. And her name is Lauren Mokarry. And she's a licensed professional therapist. And she's going to tell you all about her background. And we're going to talk about trauma today, which is, I don't know, I think of it as like the cause of all the problems of the world. That's what I think of. So with that, Lauren, I'm going to let you take it over. Give us a little background about, how you got into the mental health field and all of that.
Wow. Okay. So I actually knew from a pretty young age that I wanted to get into the mental health field. I think I was 17, and I'm going to credit you for this, actually. I think you signed me up to volunteer for an organization called Teen Lifeline. It was like something I did over the summer, and they had a 70-hour training on how to do peer support counseling over the phone. So it was a crisis hotline for teens to call in if they were feeling suicidal. And I went through that 70-hour training of how to talk to peers who were struggling with suicidal thoughts. And I remember going through that training and just thinking, like, this is really fascinating to me. Like, I just really loved the education, and even realizing a lot of the ways I was being trained to talk to people, I wouldn't have known that that's like how to support somebody. And so from there, I was interested in psychology and signed up for a psychology class my senior year of high school. And then, of course, senior year, you're trying to decide, like, what do I want to major in college? And so I have always had the kind of personality where it's like, okay, I've got a plan and here's the path. And so I kind of made my plan at that point, not really having any idea what I wanted to do in counseling or like what population I wanted to work with. I just liked the idea of learning about human behavior and psychology and being able to help people understand their lived experiences in a healthier way. So from there, I did get my undergraduate degree. I got a bachelor's in psychology. And then I went on to get my master's of science in professional counseling. And then after graduating with my master's, there's a licensure exam. So I went through that process to become a licensed counselor. And now, of course, I've been in the field for coming up on 10 years, actually. And so I'm a licensed professional counselor, meaning I'm independently licensed. Currently, I work at a practice called Thrive Therapy in Phoenix, Arizona. We are a group practice here. I'm the clinical director here, so I get the opportunity to supervise other clinicians and help to manage a lot of our programming to make sure that we have clinical excellence in everything that we're providing to our clients.
Well, I guess I don't really need to say it, but I feel very proud of you.
Thank you.
And all that you've accomplished. Let's talk about your interest in trauma. Talk about your specialty, why you chose that specialty, and then we'll get into that as a topic.
Yeah. So like I said, when I went into counseling, I really had no idea what area I wanted to specialize in. I was really open going through grad school to just kind of paying attention as I went from class to class of like, what am I interested in? What am I not interested in? And I probably started with a process of elimination. Like, I didn't feel very drawn to working with addictions or substance abuse. I really didn't feel drawn to working with kids, even though ironically I did start out working with kids because I really liked my family systems teacher and so wanted to intern under her. But actually what it was my first job. So where I did my internship and then got hired on full time after that was at a community behavioral health agency. And so I was working with kids 7 to 17 and specifically families. I did a lot of family therapy. And the agency that I worked for provided us with an opportunity to go through a trauma-informed training. The agency was really wanting to become trauma-informed. And so they brought in the Arizona Trauma Institute and had us go through a pretty extensive training to become it was a certified clinical trauma professional. And then there was like a secondary, something like certified clinical family trauma professional, something like that. And so there was a lot of education that I got through that training just about the neurophysiology of trauma and how that impacts our nervous system. And that information just felt like a game changer to me, like having language to understand why the nervous system gets a lot of anxiety or hypervigilance or depression or shutdown in response to stressors that are happening in our lives or over a duration of time in our lives, was just really like, what's the word I'm looking for? It like lit a fire where I was like, oh, I don't think I could like conceptualize therapy as well through any other lens, because this just feels like it connects all of the dots. And I really love having that scientific underpinning to understand like, oh, here's why we're seeing the symptoms that we're seeing in a way that also was really non-pathologizing. It's not like, oh, you have this, you know, unhelpful behavior that's bad and you just need to stop that and let's just teach you a different behavior, or just don't think that way, like think that differently. Like I loved having the foundation to be able to teach people and empower people to understand like, oh, of course my body is responding this way. So that was my initial introduction to trauma. It just lit a passion that I was really fascinated by that topic. And so from there, I went on to do some additional specialized trainings in trauma. So I have my training in EMDR therapy, which stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. That's a really popular trauma modality. I also have my level 1 training in something called sensory motor psychotherapy, which really works with the sensation and movement in the body and how those things are connected to our experiences going through trauma or even just through life in general. And then I also went through my 200-hour yoga teacher training so that I could get more of the somatic understanding to integrate into trauma work. And then more recently, I did my externship in something called emotionally focused therapy, which is not specifically a trauma modality. It's more an attachment and like couples counseling modality. But I've found that the attachment piece also blends really well into trauma work.
Wow. I mean, I did ask you, it took me a while to ask you why you went into trauma. And then I remember you explaining all of that to me, and it did make a lot of sense. And so you bring to the practice there something unique and something that all the other therapists can draw upon, which is very cool. So I'm going to ask you to define trauma for those who are listening who really may not have a clue, or they may think they know what it is. Mm-hmm. So let's start there. We'll go ahead and define trauma. And then maybe after that, we'll talk about some examples.
Okay. So I like to give the really broad definition of trauma as anything that overwhelms our capacity to cope. So I think about all of us having this threshold, I call it the window of tolerance, and anything that we experience where we don't have enough resources, whether that's knowledge about how to handle something or knowledge about how to communicate something or safe relational supports that we can rely on or financial stability, security, safety, power, anything that overwhelms the number of resources that we have and really pushes our nervous system into like a survival response, like a fight or flight or withdraw, collapse kind of a response, is then registered as a trauma in the body, especially when maybe after that traumatic thing happened, we still don't have the resources to help us kind of come back and process like what was the need that I didn't have resources to address. And then that feeling that overwhelms our system, the way that the brain kind of keeps going through life is it just like freezes that feeling in time and puts that feeling in a proverbial box and then locks that box in a closet and hires guards to stand outside the closet. And it's this fragmentation where it's like we had this really overwhelming feeling we couldn't cope with. Now I'm in a different situation. It's tomorrow and I need to go to school or I need to go to work. And so I'm just going to not feel that feeling and keep that over here. But I also now have to give a lot of energy to making sure that nothing triggers that feeling from coming out of the box and overwhelming me again.
On your podcast, you had mentioned that the example of that would be like a fireman. Can you like use that as an example of
Yeah.
what you mean by the resources and all that?
Yeah, and I like this example because it really shows that trauma is not always about the situation that we're in, but it's about our capacity to cope with the situation. So I use this example sometimes of if I'm in a room that catches on fire and I initially start to panic and maybe like I don't know what to do with a fire. Maybe I don't have a fire extinguisher and I don't have water close by and the fire is blocking my exit and I'm going to start to panic and really go into like, oh my gosh, I don't have any resources to pull from to get out of this situation. In contrast to if a firefighter comes into the room or if a firefighter is, his kitchen catches on fire and he does have a lot of resources to pull or she, right? There's going to be more knowledge of like, oh, I know what to do here. I know how to address this. I know the safest exit path. And so somebody with that training, somebody with those resources is going to be able to stay within their window of tolerance and kind of keep this like action plan mode online to really address the situation. It's not that it wouldn't still be stressful, but it wouldn't overwhelm the capacity to cope where maybe they're going into like a freeze. Like if I'm in the room and I don't have any of that knowledge, I might be more likely to just freeze and hope somebody comes to help.
That makes so much sense. And it's a great illustration of the contrast of having the resources and not having the resources. And particularly when you're young, you have way fewer resources, right? You have your parents
Yeah.
and their ability to cope and all of that, right?
Absolutely. And particularly, when we're children, we don't have as much power as we do when we're adults. Like there just is a power differential. Where as adults, we have a bit more capacity to manage our boundaries in certain ways, which also requires certain knowledge. Like, have I learned the language skills to say, no, I don't like that. No, that doesn't feel okay for me. Actually, I am going to choose to say no to this. Whereas when we're kids, we oftentimes don't have those language skills, especially if nobody's teaching and modeling them to us. Or if we're experiencing trauma with our caregivers, there is this power imbalance where it's like, there's really nothing I can do in this situation because I don't have the resource of power and agency.
Yeah. All right, so let's talk about some examples of trauma. And you have spoken in the recent past, about the big T trauma and the little t trauma. So if you can share with us a little bit about that, I think it would be beneficial.
Yeah, so I think most people who haven't had some additional education about trauma think of trauma as like really specific, overt events, what we would often call a big T trauma. And a big T trauma is something that almost anybody would objectively think about as being a traumatic situation. So these are things where our life is very directly threatened or our safety is very directly threatened. Big T trauma encompasses things like a car accident or a really severe physical injury, sexual assault or sexual violence, physical assault or physical violence, even verbal abuse that's at like a really intense degree. Most people could identify that as being traumatic. Obviously, things like war or, being in a direct kind of combat situation where, again, our life is threatened. Most people are going to look at those experiences and recognize like that would overwhelm almost anybody's capacity to cope. In contrast, though, there's also what we call in our field little t trauma. And little t trauma can be harder for people to recognize as trauma. something that, I often have seen in therapy, somebody might come into an initial appointment and on the intake form, we ask this question, like, do you have any trauma in your history? And people will say, no, I've not had any trauma. But then they'll start describing to me like what their childhood was like. Well, from the time I was 7, I was basically taking care of myself. My parents were at work all day and I was kind of raising the younger siblings, and I came home by myself, but that was normal. And so the reality is that when we're looking at little t trauma, we're looking at maybe events that don't look as overtly life-threatening to us, but at the developmental stage that we're at when they're occurring, they're events that are still overwhelming our capacity to get certain needs met. And as kids, we often don't even have names for some of these needs. Like I need emotional attunement from my caregivers. I need a place for co-regulation. If I'm feeling stressed, if I'm feeling scared, it is a real need for my nervous system to know that I can rely on an adult who can manage some of these things with me, alongside me. If I need help, if I'm struggling with being bullied at school, I need to know that I have a safe person who I can go to and really feel like I can get some support. And so when we're not getting some of these needs met, that still registers in the body as stress. And over time, we're having to adapt to figure out, okay, so how do I then navigate my life without being able to get these needs met? And it can feel really normal for us as we're going through, because maybe I have my basic physical needs met. And so, nothing bad is happening to me. It's just that there are good things that I need that aren't happening. And that's still being experienced as stressful in my body. And the duration of that over time really does affect our nervous system and causes us to have to adapt and protect from vulnerability in ways that we often will come into adulthood and experience some frustration of like, well, why am I having a hard time in my intimate partner relationship? Why am I having a hard time with intimacy? Why do I have a hard time with vulnerability? Why do I feel so anxious? Like I need to be controlling everything all the time or managing everybody else's feelings all the time? Why do I feel so shut down and kind of depressed? Like I'm not really connected to my own feelings. We start to see the aftermath of years, decades of the system trying to manage stress of needs that weren't being consistently met.
Yeah, so many things come to my mind and questions like, well, one of the things that reminds me of is, let's say someone's growing up with an alcoholic parent and,
Mhm.
and they come home from school and they may see a drink on the counter and
Mhm.
go, oh, I need to act this way, right? I need to
Mhm.
behave this way because now I know this is what's going on, right? Or they come home and they don't see the drink and they're like, oh, okay, I can feel safe now. And so
Yeah.
there's this in congruency of feeling safe, right?
Mhm.
And then I also wonder, like, at what point does trauma, turn into like narcissism or something like that? I mean, that's
Mhm.
probably a deeper question. I don't know if you want to address that or not, but like,
Well, I'll actually address it more broadly. Trauma can turn into so many different things, and from the trauma-informed lens in mental health, we do tend to look at a lot of the mental health diagnoses and generalized anxiety disorder, major depressive disorder, um, borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder. We do tend to look at a lot of those things through the lens of, well, when the nervous system is having to deal with this consistent lack of getting certain needs met, it is then adapting and learning to protect itself in a certain way. So, like with the example of narcissism, right? If I have not grown up where I'm getting the need for relational intimacy met, and there's going to be a few things paired with this, right? One is like, am I having other people really attuned to me and my feelings? And two, am I having people manage boundaries within our family system to help me learn that I have to have some distress tolerance to make space for other people's feelings? And that my sense of worthiness is not based on my ability to curate a certain image or to stay away from any kind of distressing feelings. And so if I'm growing up in a space where I don't have some of that quality relational intimacy that feels regulatory for my system and actually feels soothing, then I'm going to learn to self-soothe in other ways. I'm going to self-soothe through playing video games or being really good at sports or feeling like I can maintain body control and have this really like attractive image, or maybe I'm leaning on my humor, but it's now things that I have to really give a lot of protection to. And there's this fragility that can form around the sense of self when we're lacking that relational need to basically learn as we're growing up, like you're worthy of being in connection just because you exist, not because you have to perform or maintain an image in a certain way.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. All right. If we don't have access to mental health services, what can we do? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really important question because while as a therapist, of course, I recommend for everybody to get therapy if they can, if they have the resources to do that. The practice that I work at, Thrive Therapy, we're really passionate about wanting people to have free access to resources if they can't afford therapy, or if they need to supplement or space out how often they can see a therapist. So I'm going to plug two things that I'm directly involved with through Thrive. So one is through our website, which is www.thrivetherapyphx.com. We have a free client portal that anybody can set up. It's just your name and email address. And there's access through that portal to, I think at this point we have something like a dozen to 15 video courses. They range from 30 to 60 minutes where we teach on really fundamental mental health concepts like window of tolerance, attachment, boundaries, values. These are a lot of the things that we do teach directly in therapy sessions. And so to be able to access this information for free from your own phone or computer is really, really valuable. And additionally to that, we also have a podcast called Relatable with Thrive Therapy. And that's another free resource available through Spotify or Apple Podcast, where myself and two of my colleagues who specialize in different areas of counseling. So I specialize in trauma. My colleague Kayla specializes in attachment and couples work. And then Coulter specializes in OCD and anxiety. And so each episode of the podcast, we break down one theme relating to mental health. Some of that is really general themes like what is trauma? What is the path to healing trauma? What are pursuers and withdrawers in relationships? We also integrate some questions that often come up from our clients. I think our very first episode is called 10 Questions to Ask on a First Date. I had one time a group therapy that I was facilitating, and a lot of the members of the group at that time in that season were in the dating field, and they were like, if you and Kayla could write us a list of 10 questions that we should be asking people on a first date, like we would pay for that. And we were like, okay, great. We'll do you one better. We'll make a free podcast episode where you get to hear 3 therapists talk about what are some questions that you might want to think ahead about and screen for on a first date. So we release a new episode every week. And so far the feedback that we've gotten has been exclusively excellent and positive. I had one person reach out, like, I listened to one episode and it felt like 6 months of free therapy in an hour. So that I would say is a really valuable place to start, just to start getting some information.
Yeah, well, I'm going to second that because I think the podcast is excellent. And I've told you that. I love the 3 of you together. One of the things I love about good podcasts is that they're articulate, and your podcast is articulate. I think you also have an episode on, I'm not sure, correct me if I'm wrong, but like how to find a good therapist or something like that. Do you have that? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's a resource for everyone who's listening. If someone was willing to spend time journaling, what would be a good prompt?
Mm,
Did
I
we talk
love that
about this?
question.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
I love that question. Because I so many times have had people be like, journaling's not really my thing, because I think there can be this narrative, like to journal means I have to sit down and be like, Dear Diary, today's Wednesday and I had cereal for breakfast. And that doesn't feel really productive for a lot of people. So there's a few prompts that I tend to recommend starting out with. One of my very favorites is writing a letter, either to my past self, to my future self, to somebody in my life who I don't intend to actually give this letter to, but
Yeah.
just as some of the feelings that might be coming up for me in a particular relationship. That's especially valuable if I'm grieving a relationship, to be able to have a space where I can continue to kind of open some communication for my own processing, but it's not meant for like a back and forth processing. Another prompt I often will encourage is for people to pick one emotion and just write from that emotion. So if I think about, okay, if I just am going to connect with some anger that maybe is coming up in my life right now, can I just write about the anger? What do I feel angry about? How is my body letting me know that I feel anger? If the anger had a voice, if it was trying to speak a message, what would it be telling me? And then we can isolate different emotions. That can be tricky because our emotions really like intersect so much that we can get lost. I start processing anger, but now I'm talking about fear, and now I'm talking about sadness. So to pick one at a time and just really thoroughly break down, what am I feeling here? What is this emotion trying to tell me? What is my relationship to this emotion like? Maybe I notice I don't really like feeling anger. And so maybe I feel my anger starting to come up, and then I feel myself pull away from it, or I notice I think I'm angry about something, but I'm also afraid of feeling angry, or I start feeling guilty when I feel angry. So really trying to just hone in on some of our emotional experiences.
Yeah. So, you know, me and my personality, and anger is something that I repress.
Mhm.
I should probably journal about that, because, you know, then I get to a place where I just blow, right? And it feels
Mhm.
so unlike me to do that, but
Mhm.
there's a lot of people out there like me. So
Yes.
that's part of my personality. I'm peace loving, comfort, you know, harmony. So I will hold on to a lot before I explode, but then I
Mhm.
might explode.
Yeah, and that's the value of really checking in with ourselves, because anytime that we do suppress something, we can't do that indefinitely. It's just not how energy works. So I always think of like, if there's a pendulum and I'm like, I'm just going to ignore it, ignore it, ignore it, suppress it, shove it under the rug, it's fine. At some point, when we can't sustain that anymore, we're going to see this equal and opposite reaction where now it looks like it's blowing up and it feels explosive and it's not productive. And then that tends to reinforce in our brain, see, that's why you shouldn't express it. That's why you should suppress it, suppress it, suppress it. And so then we just kind of keep this pendulum swing going, versus a lot of mental health work is looking at what are the pendulum swings we have going in our life, and how can we start bringing them a little bit more back to center so that we're swinging here, right? Oh, I'm starting to feel anger about something, but I actually want to process through that so that I can communicate it in a productive way. I can figure out what I need in a productive way, versus it coming out in a not effective way.
Thank you for that. That was a great illustration, a great visual. I love that. All right.
Mhm.
Any books or resources that you'd like to recommend?
Mhm. There's always so many books that I love. I think there's a few categories that I tend to recommend to start with, just as far as general mental health information. So the first one that I think is really reader friendly, especially if we're newer to mental health concepts, I love the author Brene Brown. She is a researcher who specializes in shame and vulnerability. And she has probably 5 or 6 books out at this point, but the two that I recommend starting with, she has one book called Rising Strong. And that book is really about understanding our own story, like our own life story, and understanding the role that shame can take on in our life when we don't have a cohesive narrative around our own stories. And she offers a lot of education about shame and vulnerability, as well as some guided steps to how can we look at our own story and feel like we're able to take ownership of that in an empowering way. And then she has, I think this is her newest book out. It's called Atlas of the Heart, where she breaks down 87 different emotions and emotion adjacent experiences. And I love just the education that she provides in that. It's, again, very reader friendly. It's engaging, relatable. She uses stories and art to really just break down and help us expand that resource of language to really know our emotional experiences more deeply. So that I think is a great starting place. For trauma, I recommend two books. My favorite is called The Body Keeps the Score. That one is a little bit more dense. It's a bigger book. It's a little bit more heady. So for readers who don't like that kind of density or feel overwhelmed by that, that's probably not a good starting place. But for people who can really take in that kind of information, there's so much broken down. The author to that is Bessel van der Kolk. He's one of the leading researchers in trauma work in our field, and really talks about how trauma is stored in the body, as well as outlining a myriad of modalities for what it looks like to work through that. And then there's another trauma book called Getting Past Your Past. Getting Past My Past? I don't know if it's your or my. Getting Past Your Past, I think. And that one is more related to EMDR therapy. It's kind of rooted in that version of trauma therapy, and it's a bit more reader friendly. It's written in layman's terms and just gives a foundational conceptualization of how does trauma get stored in the body? And again, what does it look like to move through that? I also love the book on attachment and couples work. This just came out this year. It's called Secure Love by Julie Menano. She also has an incredible Instagram account called The Secure Relationship. And it's like everything that she shares on that account is just gold nuggets. They're digestible, easy to understand and read. She gives so many great examples. And I think that book is really one of the best in understanding what attachment is and how we get caught in these cycles of protection in our relationship, and then outlining skills for like, how do we shift to safer vulnerability?
Yeah, Lauren, I know that you are so passionate about this work, and you could talk about it all day long, but you don't have all day. So I want to thank you for spending the time. I mean, you have a busy life. You're working full time pretty much. You have a son who's just the light of our lives, adorable, Ellen, and you play violin on the weekends, and like you do others work on the weekends. And so you're busy. And I really appreciate that you took the time to do this, because I know you got a podcast to do too. So
that's where I'm headed next. But you're right. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. So it's really life-giving to me, any chance that I get to share in different arenas. And so I'm really grateful for you asking me to share my voice.
absolutely. Okay, well, I'm going to just say thank you for anyone who listened, and thank you again. And Lauren, let's see, Thrive Therapy PHX would be the website.
Yep.
And then Relatable is the podcast, correct?
Relatable with Thrive Therapy.
Relatable with Thrive Therapy. I highly recommend it. Is there anything else you want to say about Mental Health Month or anything like that? Mental Health Awareness Month, or just...
I mean, there's so much that I could say that I would love to say, but I think we have started at a really good place. And so especially, if you're newer to taking in information about mental health, these are some really excellent starting places. And then, of course, through Thrive's website, if you want more information about getting connected with a therapist, there's a lot to explore there as well.
All right. Well, thanks again, Lauren. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you on the next one. All right, next video.